Hello everyone and welcome to our best practices in Revit Cloud Worksharing webinar today. My name is Alan Birmaher and I'm the Customer Success Manager here at Digital Drafting Systems. And we wanted to give a special shout out to the AIA Palm Beach for hosting us today. So we are excited to go ahead and dive right in. Before we go ahead and get started, we do have a couple of logistics items here to go over. So all attendee lines will be muted for the entirety of the presentation. You can go ahead and send your questions though through the chat or questions box throughout the presentation, and we will be answering questions during our Q&A session at the end. Please do remember also to send your AIA numbers along with your first and last name so we know who you are and we can go ahead and note that information for AIA Palm Beach, and go ahead and send those over via the chat and questions box as well. This webinar will be recorded and it'll be sent to you if you're here today, so most of you should be receiving the email. And it will actually also be on our YouTube channel, I would say probably later this afternoon, if not tomorrow. Last little piece of information, for any questions, concerns, if you want to reach out to us, get in contact, you can call us at 305-445-6480 and go ahead and email us at info@ddscad.com. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get into our topic for today. So we're going to be talking about Revit Cloud Worksharing and some good best practices in a variety of different areas. So the overview that we're going to discuss today is Introduction to Revit Cloud Worksharing Platform, Linking Best Practices, Modeling, Maintenance and Requirements, Backups and Recovery, Troubleshooting, and then a question and answer session at the end, as I mentioned. All right, so Intro to RWC Platform. Okay, so what is the Autodesk Construction Cloud? So this is a question that comes up quite often. I'm going to give you guys a little summary as per Autodesk. So it'll give you the ability to bring every project team together from design to turnover on a single construction management software solution, connect workflows, and collaborate securely from a single source of truth. So the Autodesk Construction Cloud is essentially a common data environment. They call it a single source of truth. So, everybody goes to one place, so they always get the most up-to-date information. And it's essentially a platform that's been developed by Autodesk to support the life cycle, basically from design and conceptual through to construction, all the way through to the very end to turnover and operations, all within one platform. So it's very comprehensive. There's different modules that support different pieces of that life cycle. What we're going to be focusing on today here is mostly on the design collaboration piece. Just a quick note here before we go ahead and move on for those that are maybe less familiar. The Construction Cloud is basically broken down into two different tiers, right? So the first tier is going to be your hubs or accounts. And so anybody or any company rather that purchases a license of to be able to use the Construction Cloud will essentially create an account or a hub, and then within your account or hub you will go ahead and create projects. And then so each of those projects will have its folder structure with its files, its content, things of that nature, but that's how it's broken down. So it's accounts and then projects. So moving forward, one question that we get quite often and is a very valid question is, what is ACC versus BIM 360? So BIM 360 is essentially the previous platform that was used. So initially it was BIM 360 Team, then became BIM 360 Design, and now in the form of the Autodesk Construction Cloud, we're using what's called BIM Collaborate Pro for essentially the same purpose, which is Revit Cloud Worksharing through this platform. So BIM 360 is still around. Existing projects in BIM 360 are still accessible. They can still be worked on, but the new kind of side of things is the Autodesk Construction Cloud. Your license, it's important to note that you may purchase to collaborate on the Construction Cloud, will still give you access to those BIM 360 projects. So that's a nice little thing, and it's worth pointing out and keeping in mind. Now, in order to Revit Cloud Workshare, you will need a license that's called a BIM Collaborate Pro license. Those licenses are in addition to a Revit license or an AEC collection license that includes Revit as well. But basically that BIM Collaborate Pro piece is what's needed to allow you to Revit Cloud Workshare. And we're going to get into that a little bit more. So just to get some kind of the architecture logistical understanding out of the way. And again, this assumes a little bit of prior knowledge into the construction cloud and what that looks like. We're going to kind of go over varying levels of detail on this, but to kind of explain the cloud infrastructure and how it works, there's a couple different operations that will occur as we're doing this Revit Cloud Worksharing. So the write operation is essentially the user's ability to modify or add data to a Revit model stored in the cloud. And when the user syncs with Central, the data that they've changed or added to their model is uploaded to what I like to call the work in progress model in the data center. So we'll talk about the data centers in just a second, but basically that data is being uploaded to where that file is stored in the cloud, right? It's a cloud location. Let's go ahead and actually jump over to read operations first. And so we're going to talk about those. So a read operation is essentially the ability to access and view data related to a Revit model stored in the cloud itself. So just like we were writing in the write operation, the read operation is what's going to read down from the cloud. So there's multiple steps that can be used to optimize performance. We're going to touch on those throughout the presentation, actually. Operations that will essentially be considered read are model opening, resolving links, reloading the latest version where data delta / changes need to be downloaded from the cloud. So that's going to be your latest changes. And when the model being opened is more up to date than basically the cached model, that's when those latest changes are going to be brought down from the cloud. Now, a couple of things we're going to touch on here. The Revit Accelerator is going to help basically in pre-caching some of that data that has been changed by other users so that it's already ready to go, and it's going to be stored in this, it's called a pack cache, which stores some of that pre-collected changed data so that when you request it from the servers, it's already actually locally on your PC. There's no need to go and fetch that and bring it back, and it kind of speeds things up along the way. So as far as sync performance, there's a couple things that can affect it. Just a few of those are your internet bandwidth, your model complexity and size, and the location of the end user actually. There's going to be two major data centers that are used to house the construction cloud documents. One is going to be the US data center, which is based on the east coast of the US, and the other one is going to be the European data center, which is actually hosted in the Republic of Ireland. So when you go ahead and create your account initially, or your hub, it's going to actually ask you, to put the company name or the account name, and then it's going to ask you to select either US or European data center. And so that's why you'll want to go ahead and choose the one that's going to be closest to the majority of your operations. Now, that's not to say that the European data center can't be accessed by somebody in the US, but it will speed things up to go ahead and choose the data center that's going to be closest to your base of operations. Okay, so that's going to be our cloud infrastructure. So let's talk about our local infrastructure a little bit on our computers themselves. So what we have is going to be called the collaboration cache. I wanted to talk about that first. So that's actually going to be when you open a model that's located in the cloud, similar to what some of you may be used to when you're working on a central model in a local server in your office. It's going to create a local copy of that central model. And so that's what you actually work on, make changes to, and then you synchronize with that central model that's in the server, or in our case, in the cloud. But the collaboration cache is where those models, the local ones, are actually stored. And so if you look on the right side here, this is actually going to be the location where you can find that collaboration cache. Now, that's not something you typically want to mess with or you want to get into too much. We'll talk about that a little more in just a little while. But just so you're aware of where that location is, because that is a question that does come up quite often for us. So the next piece here, the Revit Accelerator that we just mentioned, right? So what we said was that that's going to keep this pack cache, which is kind of our pre-change, or let's say pre-request. It's going to keep the changes as up to date as possible from other members of the team or other people who are working on the models. So it is seen as a background process on the computer. It is running constantly in the background. We do suggest that you don't close that. And again, this is something we're going to touch on, I think, in the next slide or two. But the reason we say that is because if, as long as that's running and open and the computer's on while other people are making changes to the model, it's going to, do its best job at keeping everything consistent across the board from your computer to the other collaborators' computers. And then again, this pack cache piece is the piece that actually holds those changes until they're requested, at which point they're essentially reflected in that collaboration cache. Okay, so continuing on here, the first time you open a project will be the slowest. That's pretty much universal here. And the reason for that is because the project likely has not been cached on your system yet. So again, same thing as when you're creating your local, from a central model in your server, that first open, you're gonna have to basically copy all that data down to your machine. So that's gonna take the longest. Once you've done that the first time, as long as you haven't cleared that cache, which again, we don't suggest you doing unless you're having an issue, it's actually opening a local version, and then it's just checking for those latest changes in both in the cloud and in that pack cache that we talked about. All right, next step here. So you should avoid clearing that collaboration cache or the pack cache. That is a suggested solution for certain issues that may arise, and in those cases, that's what we need to do. But obviously, if you clear those things out, the next time you open, you need to bring all those things back down again. So we suggest not touching that unless you really need to. And kind of, again, to specify it one more time, keeping the Revit accelerator running is important. Not turning off your computer, ideally, when other people are collaborating on the same project, will kind of help keep that consistency across the board. Not that that data won't be fetched the next time you go look for it, but again, it's just all for ease of use and performance and getting things done faster. So that pack limit, okay, so the pack collaboration limits that we had discussed. So basically that pack will hold up to 40 files total or 10 gigabytes of data, whatever comes first. And so as latest changes are made, that data becomes overridden if it hasn't been consumed by the actual Revit model itself being opened. So it's not going to weigh your computer down too much, let's say, but it's something to keep in mind that it will only keep so much data there, and if you're not using that data, it's it won't be retained in that pack cache. On the right side here, I did also just want to illustrate, this is something that many of you are probably familiar with if you're already working with the models in the cloud, and essentially it's the little view that you'll see when you go open a model, right? So it'll show you the loading bar up here, and then this is kind of just a cool thing to point out. So this top bar right here is going to be the data that's being downloaded, and then this bottom bar right here is going to be the data that's being actually processed, loaded, opened. And so let's actually jump to this next slide. So this is kind of an interesting point, right? So in the red up here, the data download, what can affect this? It would be network issues typically, right? Internet issues, connectivity issues, internet speed, that kind of thing. But then in terms of actually opening those files, processing those files, pulling them up on your screen, that's typically going to be an issue related more to complexity of the model, processing time, things of that nature. Your computer specs really will play a big part in that as well. So that's just an interesting representation that I had found online that I thought was interesting. So I wanted to share that with you all. All right, so moving right along. So let's talk about linking best practices. So linking is a hot topic, let's say. It's obviously a very important piece of the collaborating in the cloud. So what I wanted to do here first was just talk about two important pieces that can be a little bit confusing at first, and then we'll get into the actual linking itself. But these are important pieces towards that linking process. So uploading projects to the cloud, how do you do it, right? So the correct way to do this, you may be tempted to open the web browser representation of your project, upload a file directly there. That's the wrong way to do it. That's not going to work from a Revit Cloud Worksharing perspective. In order to properly upload a Revit Cloud Worksharing model, you need to go ahead and open that local model first. If it's already in a cloud or in a server, you'll basically go ahead and open and detach that model from the central model, save it locally. So then you're opening that local model, you're making sure it's already saved locally, and then once you've done that, in your Revit, you're going to go ahead and click on the Collaborate tab up here. You're going to choose the Collaborate button. This won't be grayed out. And then after that, you're going to get a similar pop-up to this. Some versions of Revit just have a second button that says collaborate in the cloud. Just use your best kind of interpretation there. Things change a little bit version to version, but essentially you're looking for a collaborate button or a collaborate in the cloud button. And if it's the collaborate button, then here you would choose either within your network or in the cloud. And so we would choose in the cloud, we would say okay. We would choose where in an existing project you'd want that to live. So you do need to create the project in the web browser beforehand, as well as your folder structure, if you had a certain folder structure you wanted to adhere to. And then you're going to go ahead and click initiate. On that last slide, it's worth noting you can change the name of the project as well. So if you detached it from a central model, for example, the end of your project name will say _detached. You can remove that. But this is an important piece of the puzzle, right? This upload process. Now, once the model is uploaded, you might be tempted to go look in your, in your open dialog here in your Revit homepage. Again, not going to be the way that you want to do this, because what you're going to be seeing there are like local models. They're not your Revit Cloud models. So when you want to actually open one of your Revit Cloud models, you're going to open up your Revit. You're going to look on the bottom left side, and you're going to look for something like this, Autodesk Docs. In certain versions of Revit, it's going to say BIM 360. It's changed kind of throughout time. The latest versions of AutoCAD say Autodesk Projects instead. I don't know if that's coming to Revit or not, but just so you're aware, you're looking for something similar to this. And then once you're here, you're going to go ahead and choose your hub, your project, and you're going to navigate your folder structure to get to the location where the actual project is. You're going to click on it, and that's how it's going to go ahead and open. And that's when you're going to see that dialog, this thing that we had seen before, right? It's going to go ahead and open using this, and then hopefully will open successfully. So now that we've covered those kind of basics, let's talk about linking itself. So there's 3 different linking methods. Linking is essentially what you're going to use as your method for, most of you probably know this, but just in case. So if you have an architect working on a project as well as an MEP, the architect has their own model, the MEP has their own model, and they link to each other's models to basically have a visual representation of what's included in the other team's model. This helps them collaborate and work together while still keeping the model that they're working in a little bit lighter, a little bit more flexible, which is always a good thing. So in terms of that linking, though, there's different ways to do it within the Construction Cloud. And this gets sometimes a little confusing, doesn't make a ton of sense all the time. If you still have issues after this presentation understanding what this flow looks like, reach out to us. I'd be happy to give you a little one-on-one presentation and discuss it with you. So essentially, live linking is the first method, right? That's what we call an uncontrolled linking method. And essentially, the way that works is you link directly to where that model is living for the other team. So I'm the architect, and I'm going to link directly to the MEP's model in their MEP folder, in the folder structure here. That's the first option. What happens there, as the architectural team is working, they're synchronizing, they're doing their thing, and the MEP is seeing those latest, I apologize, the MEP is making those changes. As the architect is syncing and reloading and reopening those projects, they're going to be pretty much instantaneously seeing those changes from the MEP. We'll talk about the pros and cons of that in just a few moments here. The next type of linking method is going to be called the shared linking method. Now, this is the first level of controlled linking, or what Autodesk calls controlled linking. So basically, you'll see the changes after the team that has made those changes decides that they want to go ahead and share those changes. This is a little confusing. It's not going to make a ton of sense yet. I'll show you some screenshots in a little bit that are going to help illustrate that a little bit better. But essentially, in this case, the architectural team will link to the MEP's model in the shared folder. So the MEP will go in, they're going to decide when they're ready to share their model. Once they click that share button, the model that they have in their MEP folder is going to be copied into this MEP folder in the shared folder structure. So again, MEP will come in, they will say share the model will be copied to their MEP folder where the architectural team will be linking to. And so the next time the architectural team reloads that link, they're going to see whatever's been the latest thing that's been copied in that MEP folder. in the shared MEP folder. So the architect doesn't need to do anything additional. It's nothing different. It's nothing extra. It's just where you link from that will determine when you're going to see those changes. And now the last and most controlled method is what's called the consumed linking method. And essentially, the consumed linking method is one where all of what we've just talked about has to happen. The changes need to be made, they need to be published, they need to be shared by the team. But then instead of it being basically under the control of the MEP team to say, here, this is the latest stuff, go ahead and have visibility to it now, the actual architect in this case will have to go in, look for those latest updates, and decide, okay, I'm ready to consume these latest changes. And in that case, you're going to go ahead and click that consume button. And then basically what's in the shared folder is going to be copied into the architect's own consumed folder in the MEP location. Again, this location doesn't change. You link to it once, and then all you need to do is continue to consume those changes as you're ready. Now, the reason that can be beneficial, and again, we're going to talk about the pros and cons, is that, you know, if your team is off to a good rhythm, they're doing some good stuff, and, you know, they're waiting for those latest changes, you know, but let's say the latest changes come in, the other team says, okay, I'm ready to share them, but then they're in the middle of something, and now all of a sudden there's this whole new piece to the puzzle that they weren't ready for, they weren't expecting. This gives you the ability to decide when those latest changes are seen by your own team. So there's a lot of value there as well. And you can use all of these different methods in the same project if you wanted to. I would not, for consistency's sake and just to keep everybody on the same page. But it really just all depends where you're linking from, or linking to rather. So let's talk about each of those, or well, actually, yes, let's first talk about a couple of questions that you may want to ask in determining which of those is the best method for you or for your project. So the first question, right? How large is the project itself? The bigger the project, the more complex, the heavier it's going to be. Some suggestions here would be, for example, closing work sets on open to minimize the wait time. Then you have to actually open those work sets as you need to use them, and then placing the links on those specific work sets so that they're only opened when they're needed, right? Are you working across multiple time zones and multiple teams? So when there's more changes being made more often, right? If there's more teams in the mix, you're going to see that things are going to be needing to refresh or be needing to download and upload those changes more often. That's obviously going to slow things down as well. That's one of the limitations of the live sharing. Additionally, when there's certain parts of the day that are obviously going to be more strenuous or more congested, let's say, where the corporate bandwidth, you know, a lot of people are going to be opening, you know, projects, things like that first thing in the morning. That's going to be a harder time of day because there's less bandwidth to offer. So, you know, essentially you won't be able to do things as quickly. Things may take more time, things of that nature. Again, the personal accelerator, keeping that running in the background while others are working will help, if at all possible, because it's going to bring those latest changes over as that work is happening, which is always going to be beneficial. It's going to help you because nothing needs to be really downloaded from the cloud. It's just being processed locally, so things will happen faster. So the next question, how frequent are the updates needed? So again, if it's something that needs to be happening very frequently, live linking is your best bet, right? You don't need to go through any extra steps. You know, as those changes are made, you're going to see those latest changes as well. If it's something where those changes don't need to be reflected as often, it makes a lot more sense from a usability standpoint to go ahead and use either the share or consume method. That's going to be, you know, it'll be a little bit slower in theory, or not slower, I apologize. It'll happen less often, the synchronizing or the updates that you'll see, but the performance of your model itself will actually be faster because, you know, you're not going to have that constant drain trying to refresh and trying to resync those changes. And then the last question is how many people are using the model at the same time or the file at the same time. So if you have too many people working on the same file simultaneously, you can eventually see some slowness. This is why, you know, dividing a model into an architectural model, an MEP model, a structural model is typically a good practice, and then having each of those linked to each other, because that's going to be a lot lighter on the model. You're going to have a lot less people working on the model simultaneously, and, you know, less synchronization, things like that. So that's definitely the suggested practice. Now, if you have a very small group of people working, you might be able to get away with a single model. But again, we see them, I would say 95% of our customers using some sort of linking situation in the cloud. All right, so now let's talk about the 3 linking methods. So let's talk about live linking first. So it's going to be the slower performance, like we talked about, because it's constantly pulling those changes, because those links are constantly updating. So the pros, it's going to be one of the most up-to-date ways to keep everybody on the same exact page as much as possible, at least, and it's handy in a time crunch for that same reason. But of course, the con is that all of the changes are going to be visible all the time. So that's a con because it's going to be a higher strain on your network, but also again, because if you didn't necessarily want somebody to be able to pull the rug out from under you and make a change that's going to affect your production, you're not going to have a way to control that. You're going to see those changes and that's it. So those are some reasons to help maybe in determining that. So next would be the shared linking method. So as I mentioned, when you're actually doing the sharing, you need to first publish the model, your model in Revit, and then you need to basically jump up to the Construction Cloud web page, the web viewer, and you're going to go to your design collaboration section. You're going to go and find that you have these what they call swim lanes. And so these swim lanes are basically timelines of these shared packages or consumes of the packages. And so you're going to see your MEP in this case, and you're going to see a shared. And so on the shared, you'll see the packages that have been shared by other teams. So here we have an open circle. That's a package that's been shared that we have not consumed. And then down here, we have some packages, right? And so these are shared packages that we've consumed in the past. So what we're going to do here is we would click on the plus. We would check the box next to the model that we're hoping to share. And we would go ahead and click a share button there. And once that happens, the model that's in our MEP folder would be copied to the MEP folder in the shared folder, and that's where everybody using that shared method would link from. So they would, next time that they refresh or next time that they see those latest changes, would basically now see that latest version that's been shared. So again, they don't do anything extra. It's just I choose when I share. Once I share, they're going to see those latest changes. So now, the designated person basically, yes, like I said, will release that model by sharing the package. All users will see that version on their next open or on the next refresh or on the next reload of that link. It does not update until the owner shares that next package, like we talked about. This will reduce bandwidth and hard drive use, as well as reducing the collaborative data loss because, since things have time, it's not like everything is just kind of jumping on top of each other, which sometimes does result in some collaborative data loss. Additionally, it'll minimize the potential for problems with incomplete or in progress content. Okay, so basically that same point. And now lastly, going ahead to the consumed linking methods, the consumed linking method, essentially in this case, you take it one step further, right? So this is the flip side of what we just saw, right? So now we're seeing the architectural team perspective here. This, keep in mind, you'll only see as an admin where you have the ability to jump from team to team. Otherwise, you'll just see your team and a shared path here. So we see this, this shared that just happened, right? We just shared this from the MEP side. We see the open circle here. So if we click on that open circle and we then click consume, the file will now be copied to our own consume folder. So in the project structure architecture, in our own architectural folder, in the MEP folder, there will now be the copy of that model. And so we'll be linking from that location instead. And so in that case, the release model, again, is approved and accepted by an individual, generally the team lead, and all the users see that version on next open, next refresh, next sync. And so it does not update until the consumption is basically deemed appropriate by the receiving party. And it allows for review of the design before impacting the work by the larger team. So that is actually accurate as well. So when I click on this circle here, showing me that latest share package, it will actually go ahead and preview those latest changes. So I can actually see a visual representation of those changes, and I can see if that's going to affect my existing progress, my production. And so I can determine, maybe right now is not the right time. Let's consume this in a few days and bring in those latest changes. So there's a lot of power and flexibility there as well. All right, so a couple of do's and don'ts. So Option to remove Revit Cloud Worksharing linked files when publishing from Revit to the ACC or BIM 360. That's something that's a recent addition that's been added as of Revit 2023.1. But when you go ahead and publish, which happens, by the way, from your open area here, typically, you go ahead and find the file. You go ahead and once you see update available here, that means changes have been made since your latest publish. You're going to go ahead and click on these three dots, and then you have this option to publish latest without links. And so what that's going to do is it's going to be a lighter publish, but it's going to basically leave those links behind, because really those links don't necessarily need to be published, but you'll still have access to them. They'll still be latest next time you open the file. So that again lightens things and makes things a little bit faster. All right, next section here. So some more do's and don'ts. Do not link Revit Workshare models from the desktop connector. So the desktop connector, for those of you that don't know, is essentially a piece of software that will, once installed, allow you through your file explorer essentially to see your Autodesk docs or your construction cloud almost like an external hard drive. Think about it as a Google Drive or Dropbox or something like that, where you install that plugin and then you're seeing it as an external drive on your computer, on your file explorer. So that's going to do the same thing. You're going to basically have to choose what projects you'd like to synchronize. I think they go up to 40 right now. And then so those projects will show up there. But very common mistake is to try to link from or open those Revit Workshare models from that location. Definitely don't want to do that. When you open from that location, you're basically opening a local copy. It's like if you went ahead to your server and opened that central model from there. It's a bad idea. Don't do it. Go through Revit like we talked about before and through that Autodesk Docs button. And then when you're linking, you don't want to link from there either. You want to definitely go ahead and link from the external resources area. As you can see here, external resources. So when you actually go into Revit, you try to link a file, you're going to get a pop-up that says import link Revit, and it's going to default to this external resources area. That's going to default right into your project. You just find the file, you link it from there, and that's the way you want to do it. You don't want to do it by searching in this PC and going to the desktop connector. That, again, is just open a can of worms for potential headaches in the future. Okay, so I did want to just show this here real quick. I covered this already to some extent a couple of slides ago here. But basically for publishing, the way to publish is to come back out here to your Autodesk Docs file open area, go to your three dots, and then go ahead and say publish latest or publish latest without links. Up to, I believe it was version 23 or 24, there was another way to do this within the program itself, and that was from the Manage Cloud Models dialog, I believe. So you would go to your Collaborate tab, Manage Cloud Models, select Autodesk Docs project, find the model in the project, and then click on the little upload button. That no longer works in the latest versions of Revit. I don't recall if it's just 24 or if it's 23 as well, but just so you're aware, that no longer works. So you have to do it, at least last I checked. They may have added something or changed something. They're, Autodesk is always making changes. But I believe you do need to do it now from that open area, file open area. All right. So place Revit links into separate work sets. This is a good practice like we talked about, because especially when you're opening without, with those work sets closed, it won't be such a heavy open initially. You can control the visibility of each link in any view of the entire project. These work sets should also be closed when not in use, like we just talked about, and then close all the linked work sets during model open if the model is very heavy, using the specific option. And so you see that specific option here will actually allow you to open specific work sets. So you see that dialog box right here. So you basically choose what's going to open, what's not going to open, and again, that will lighten the load if it's a very heavy model. If it's something light, if it's something smaller and you're not having performance issues, don't worry about it. Just go ahead and open it the normal way. But it's a good backup, essentially, in case you need that alternative. So just something to keep in mind as well. Okay, so this is something pretty exciting. I wouldn't say that it's fully rolled out yet. It's something that's been coming for a while. It's finally more useful now, but it's not perfect yet. So essentially what this is called is Autodesk is calling this bridge. And so basically what bridge allows you to do is, let's say there's a situation where you are hosting your project and you have a consultant that wants to host their own models for your project. In the past, everybody had to be hosted in one hub. That is something that this bridge support is blurring the lines on, because in theory with bridge, what you can do is you can mirror a folder in your project to a folder in their project in a totally separate hub. And so it gives you the ability to link those Revit Cloud models from one project through to another project. Specifically in Revit 2024, I believe, again, this is a fairly new change. And so essentially, those folders will automatically synchronize with each other. Now, you can do this with an individual file as well, but as you can see here, when you're doing it with a file, it will not let you choose this option that will automatically sync as changes are made. And so that's because with the individual file, it's just going to copy the file. If you do this for a folder, you can check this box, and as you make changes to anything in that folder, it will be copied over automatically. So one thing that I've been seeing in the very few implementations of something like this that I've seen is essentially where the person sharing will go to their shared folder. They will share their own disciplines folder from there through Bridge. And so essentially they have the control to decide when that share is going to happen by using that same shared linking method workflow, even though they're not really using it for its typical intended purpose. But you're basically saying when you share, it's going to copy to that shared folder, which is mirrored over to this other project. So that's a pretty cool use of that as well. Right, and so the latest changes, that's another difference, is you can't do any live linking. You will only see those changes when those changes have been published. So when you go into the web browser, and we're going to get into this in just a couple slides, what you're seeing in the web browser is not actually your live version from Revit. It's your latest published version. The version on Revit actually lives in a parallel Revit Cloud Worksharing service server, which I like to call our work in progress area or work in progress model. But until a publish happens, it doesn't copy that latest data up to the kind of viewer construction cloud side of things in the browser. And so these latest changes in Bridge are only seen after a publish occurs. So again, we'll talk about that a little more. Don't worry if you're a little confused. I have a graphic that's going to illustrate that a little bit better in just a couple of slides here. All right, so modeling, maintenance, and requirements. Let's go ahead and jump into this one. So in some best practices basically here, avoid unnecessary complexity in your model, always a good idea. Limit computation, room line separation should be minimized, keep minimum phases. This is all just going to keep everything simple. Keep CAD imports to a minimum. It'll keep your model light, breezy, just more easily able to be worked on. It'll cause you less trouble in the long run. So, always limit your complexity, limit whatever you can, keep things as simple as possible. Simple is better typically. Next thing, load only what you're working on. So again, this is the work set strategy that we talked about. If you separate by work sets, only load the work sets that you need. Don't, view or load the ones that you don't need. That'll help as well because it's going to keep what your computer's actually doing a little bit lighter. Next thing, don't disable the Revit accelerator. You may be tempted. Again, it is a background process that runs in the background. It shouldn't be hurting anything. It runs, it does minimal stuff in the background, but it does run in the background. So just keep that in mind. It will help you in your collaboration as it continues. Remember to sync often. That's important. If you're not syncing, you're not essentially saving. Not to say that you won't be able to recover that if you close, if something happens, your program crashes and you need to reopen it, you may be able to still sync those latest changes, but it's a tough thing sometimes, and so sync often. No hard enforcement on file size or limitation. So that's, I don't think I mentioned that yet. There's no limit to the number of projects that you can host on the cloud or the size of those files or the size of the storage. So go wild, essentially. All right, so some modeling best practices here. On complex projects, it is suggested that you audit typically on a daily basis, if not often, maybe on the first open of the day, just to make sure you don't have anything funky that you need to address. Along with that, check your warnings regularly. That's something that we see overlooked very, very often. They see a warning here, a warning there. Oh, not a big deal. Probably nothing. But then next thing you know, you have 400 warnings and you have an issue, and the only way to fix the issue is to start from scratch, or go warning by warning, figuring out what went wrong. Those warnings are typically there for a reason. Don't ignore them. Check those often. Additionally, minimize your unused views. Always relinquish when syncing, and then purge often. Typically, once a week is fairly safe, but that's always a good idea as well. And again, these are just things to keep things working well, keep things on the modeling side of things working smoothly. All right, so I just wanted to talk a little bit about hardware requirements. You can look up the hardware requirements for Revit online. I was going to include that link here, but I didn't. But if you just Google Revit and then your version requirements, it'll show you what you need, what they suggest in terms of RAM, processing power, graphics card, things like that. But I wanted to talk specifically a little bit about storage here and the cloud. So typically, I would suggest having a minimum of 5 gigabytes of disk storage available at any time. With most typical disk drives, that was not typically an issue. They were typically a little larger. For solid state drives, those were small more typically until, let's say, a little more recently. So I would suggest always go a little bigger on your hard drive, on your solid state drive when you upgrade, just to make sure you have space. Remember, every time you open one of these models, it has to open the whole model, store it locally in your cache. It has those latest changes stored in that packed cache as well. So you always want to keep at least 5 gigabytes free, and then minimum of 3 times the total payload or size of that cloud model accessed by the user. Because again, it's just one of those limiting factors that is going to cause you a headache at some point. And then as far as RAM requirements, they typically would recommend 20 times the total file size in RAM. So here's a little formula: 20 times current file size plus the sum of all the linked file sizes, because again, when you link those files in, it's opening them as well. It has to hold them in RAM. RAM, for those that don't know, random access memory. It's temporary storage, but anytime basically you open anything on your computer, it's held in RAM. So the more RAM you have, the more easily your computer is able to multitask. So again, essentially here, for a file that's just a quarter of a gigabyte plus 2 gigabytes of links, they suggest about 7 gigabytes of RAM at least. Most computers these days, productivity-wise, you're seeing 16, 32 gigs. And so that should be pretty safe. But again, it depends on the size and the complexity of your model. So a couple of bandwidth requirements here that I just wanted to share as well. These are just 3 kind of potential numbers of megabits per second, so internet speed that you're looking for in terms of working in the cloud. I think this is pretty low. I would say 25 megabits per second is fairly standard across the board, at least in most cases here. Now, what it does say is symmetrical 25 megabits per second. That means 25 megabits per second up and down, so for upload and download. I would say in most cases, you're probably hovering in this range. These days, it's not atypical to see, gigabit connections that are 1,000 megabits per second plus, So not something that I think most of you will have to worry about if you have a stable internet connection, but it's something worth noting. Now, with lower than recommended bandwidth, and I think we mentioned this prior, you basically open the door to certain failures for STCs, element borrowing, initial collaboration, model opening. Any of that sort of thing can be affected. And then other team members that have solid connections may face issues as well because your connection speed, was not up to par, and basically for element borrowing and things like that, they're not able to, those elements are not returned back to the pool for them to be able to borrow them and make changes, let's say. Additionally, I did want to go ahead and include a list of some of the URLs that may be accessed in this process. And so these might be a good idea to add to your whitelist on your firewall, just in case, to make sure your firewall is not blocking any of the important web addresses that are being accessed through this whole process. So just something to keep in mind. Check into that. It's worth noting it as well. As far as these things go, you can always kind of adopt the if it ain't broke, don't fix it mentality. But if something is not working, this might be the culprit. So just keep that in mind. All right, so updates. Updates are important. Typically, what we would always recommend is to be on the same build of Revit as your collaborators. The reason for this is because from one Revit build to another, little things may change, but it could, throw wrenches into your productivity. Now it's important to note, I don't mean from Revit 23 to 24, for example. As most of you, I would assume, would know, with Revit, you're stuck on the version that you're working on. You can always upgrade a project, but you can't downgrade it back. So if you're collaborating with somebody on version 23 and you're on version 24 and you send them a file, they're not going to be able to open your file. But if they send you a file, you'll be able to open it. But once you make your changes and send it back, they won't be able to open it again. So always want to be on the same version, but then beyond that, on the same build. So that's 2024.1.3, for example, is the build itself. So that's what you want to make sure you're aligned on with your collaborators. If a user has an issue, my first go-to whenever I'm supporting somebody is to go to updates first. There's a very common license checkout timeout error that seems to plague AutoCAD more than Revit, but very common issue, typically related to missing licensing updates. Always check updates. There may be a new version or a new build of Revit. There may be a licensing update. You don't have to necessarily run every single update if there's plugins in there, things that you're not using. But I always suggest at least doing any hot fixes, version or build releases, and anything licensing, single sign-on, identity manager, anything like that. I would go ahead and knock those out. And so these updates, this window that we're seeing here is a program called Autodesk Access that will come installed with anything Autodesk that you install these days automatically. That replaced a program that was called Autodesk Desktop App, which some of you may have experienced. It was not always the most stable thing in the world. Sometimes you had to uninstall it and reinstall it to get in. But basically that had a lot more to it. Access is more simple. It just gives you your updates here. This will show you updates specifically that you do not have installed on your computer. So it's specific to what's on your computer, not necessarily what you have access to in the cloud. Also, it has a link up here to view all your products and services if you want to download another program that you have access to, or if you want to go into your Autodesk account where you actually have an option which is called product updates, where you can go and manually download some of these updates and run them if you're having any sort of issues using it, doing it through Autodesk Access. So always good to keep up to date. That's always a good idea. All right, so let's jump over to backup and recovery. And so this is what I mentioned to you guys before. So when you're working with these models in the cloud, when you initiate that work sharing down here in Revit, it's going to go ahead and throw that up here to this Revit Cloud Worksharing service. This is what I mentioned to you that I call the work in progress area. As you're working in Revit and you're syncing with your central, you're making new versions here in this work in progress area. But you can see up here, the published documents area, this is what you see through the web browser. This is not getting all of these uploads, right? These publishes, or these syncs, I'm sorry. You're only seeing it when you publish, and that's on purpose. That's because, you don't want to overwhelm this kind of the Autodesk Construction Cloud level of things with all these all of these syncs. You really want to use that as a viewer mostly for people who need to go and look and do their thing, but are not necessarily needing to see every minute little change. Typically, we see something like this being scheduled or manually done once a week, let's say. You can schedule that through the desktop, the design collaboration area on the web browser. But it's just interesting to note. It's a good illustration here. It's something that was, to me, a little confusing at first. Why when we're syncing up here or when we're syncing with Central, why am I not seeing those changes in the cloud? I get that question all the time. It's because you're not publishing, you're just syncing, and it's kind of getting to this middle step. I have been asked, how can we see what's in here? There's no web browser, there's no way to see that from anywhere other than from Revit itself. And we'll talk about that a little bit more shortly. One more thing to point out, you can see on this initial cloud work sharing, we go up here as a version 1, we go up here as a version 2. Uh, that's why anytime you upload a Workshare model to start the collaboration, you're always going to see a version 2 as a starting point. Dead giveaway that you did it right. So keep that in mind. On the right side here, I did just want to point out here the version history. This is from the web browser of the published version history. And so here you can see various versions. And one thing I want to point out is, so here we get to version 4. We decided, you know what, I don't like that latest version, something changed, something happened, and I want to make version 3 the current. And so we did that, and you can see it takes version 3, makes it current, but then next time you publish, you're seeing here version 5. So we're not overwriting, we're not messing up our sequence, but it does allow you to make a prior version current. Now this is just on the publish side. This is not in that work in progress side of things. So keep in mind, on the work in progress side, you will still need to possibly go about other ways of recovery, which we'll talk about in just a second here. Additionally, you can download versions from here. This is important up to version 2022.1, I think, where you were finally allowed to view and open earlier syncs or earlier versions. Up until that point, this was your only way to recover previously published versions. And that's why we do suggest to publish fairly often, at least once a week. And so this is what we were just talking about. So Revit 2022 and earlier versions for the work in progress model, previous versions were not accessible to restore, only from what you had published, like we talked about. Published models can be downloaded and saved as detached models from the web browser only, and then re-uploaded. But then as of 2022.1, users are allowed to view and open earlier versions of cloud models. Okay. And so beyond that, as of Revit 2023 and beyond, you can actually restore to a prior version directly without losing the history, which is pretty nice. So you click here, restore version, and then it'll actually allow you to restore from that previous version directly in here. Next time you open, you're looking at the previous version. It's a pretty nice tool, has made a lot of customers very happy recently when we pointed that out to them. Okay, and so this is our last section before our Q&A. It's going to be our troubleshooting. And so this is a common issue that you may run into. The model, and it'll show you the file name is missing many elements and it cannot be opened, or the file data is corrupt. Some possible solutions for something like this would be to have another user who is able to open and work on the model synchronize using the compact option, to attempt to open the model with all work sets closed to identify if there's a potential problematic link. That happens very often. Attempt to recreate the problem on another system. So again, having somebody open, if they're able to open, maybe sign them out, sign yourself in and see if you're able to open, see if it's an account issue or if it's something else. Open the file with audit. And then beyond that, if none of those work, you can gather the journal file with the error messages and you can go ahead and send those over to us. If we are your reseller, and we can go ahead and get a case going with Autodesk for you to go ahead and help you figure out what's going on there. So this is a very common one that we run into. You're getting any of these sorts of things, grayed out model in Revit, or any of these splash screens when you're trying to open a model. You're typically either missing a BIM Collaborate Pro license or you're missing the permissions in the project itself on the Construction Cloud to see those certain files. So I'm going to show you that permissions thing here a little closer. The best way to check if you have the license applied to your user is to go back to that Autodesk Access that I showed you, click on View All Products and Services. Alternatively, you can get there through manage.autodesk.com, sign in, and under All Products and Services, see if you find BIM Collaborate Pro. If it's there, you have the license. If it's not there, you don't, and you need to talk to your admin to have them assign that license to you. Otherwise, you will not be able to open that model from Revit. As far as permissions go, you can actually set permissions on a folder, subfolder, project-wide basis, and you can assign those permissions based on individual users by name or email, or depending on their role or the company that they're associated to. And the reason that that's great, and we do see a lot of people using the company option, is because when you add a user, essentially you can say any user that's added here from Digital Drafting Systems automatically has this level of permissions to see this folder. And so that's extremely helpful. That helps minimize some of those issues that we just talked about, because it gives you the ability to throw somebody in and then you don't have to do anything else, right? You just add them and they're good to go. But that's one potential cause of one of those errors, that you don't actually have visibility to the project. All right, so why am I seeing a version on the Construction Cloud website, a version 3, but I'm not seeing my latest changes, my latest syncs? We talked about this, right? This is because your latest syncs are syncing to an intermediary step, like we talked about here, to this Revit Cloud Worksharing area, but not to the web browser until you publish. So you're not publishing your latest changes, and that's why you're not seeing those latest things. So interesting thing to keep in mind. Took me a while to figure this one out, but once we wrapped our heads around it, it made a lot of sense. Okay, and so the last thing here I just want to touch on briefly, if you run into any issues, you have any questions, anything like that, you can always reach out to us. But if you do, try to figure it out on your own first, and you go ahead and Google your issue, your error message, whatnot, you'll often come to an Autodesk Knowledge Network article that talks about how to fix something. They've recently started putting these troubleshooters out there, which are really cool. You go into the troubleshooter, where are you encountering the issue, opening or linking the cloud model, and you basically work through some questions where it will tell you what you need to do to fix your issue. So, something interesting, very good tool to have. It's not for everything, but if you find one of these things, go ahead and try it out. We found it to be very beneficial. All right, so we're gonna go ahead and jump into questions and answers here. I know we don't have a lot of time. I'm gonna just go ahead and choose one or two here. Let me just jump through here. So one was about the storage. How much storage do we have in the cloud? We talked about that one. Unlimited projects, unlimited storage. Okay, if I have a 30-day trial of a project with projects in it, can it be converted to a full site? Yes, so when you go ahead and purchase the license, just let us know that that's the case, and we'll go ahead and tell you where to find your site ID, which is basically a number, an identification number that Autodesk will need to convert that site, but you will not lose your progress, you will not lose your projects, so don't worry about that. Can I use the BIM Collaborate license for Revit Cloud Worksharing instead of BIM Collaborate Pro? Okay, so that's a very good question. The BIM Collaborate Pro versus BIM Collaborate licenses, the only difference is the Revit Cloud Worksharing piece. So you need the Pro to be able to Revit Cloud Workshare. BIM Collaborate license has the same Autodesk Docs access, design collaboration access, model coordination access. The only piece it doesn't have is the piece that lets you work on Revit in the cloud. So keep that in mind. You do need the Pro license if you want to go ahead and do this. Just because we're getting to the top of the hour here and I see some people starting to drop off, if you do need to drop off, please don't forget to send over your AIA number and your first name and last name so that we can go ahead and make sure you receive your continuing education credit. All right, so I've got two more questions here. I think we can knock them out real quick. So can Revit LT be used to collaborate on projects in the cloud? The short answer is no. There is some workflows where you can pull a model down and edit it in Revit LT and then you have to re-upload it, but you lose your history. I mean, the short answer is no. You need Revit and you need a BIM Collaborate Pro license, whether that Revit is a standalone Revit or it comes from an Autodesk or an Architecture, Engineering, Construction Collection package. Full Revit and BIM Collaborate Pro are what you need to actually work on that cloud environment. Okay, and I think I have time for this last question. Are there file types that are not supported in the cloud? So that's actually a really good question. Most file types are. Last time I checked, there was like 100+ file types that were supported. Some that are not. URLs are not supported to be stored in the cloud. PC shortcuts. BAK files, I think, are not, like backup files. I know when you upload like a Revit file, like a local file that has its backup files internally in there as well, it won't upload those. It will just keep the Revit full file version. And that's because it keeps backups internally, so there's really no need for that. And I believe INI files as well. Yeah, I don't think it'll let you run or store INI files on the cloud as well. Those are the only ones that I can think of off the top of my head, but most file types will work. If you have any specific questions, reach out, let us know. All right, and that's it. So let's go ahead and jump over to our closing slide here. So thank you all so much for being here today for our best practices and Revit Cloud Worksharing webinar. Our blog is live. You can go ahead and check it out at ddskcad.com/knowledge-center/Autodesk. We have videos up there for Revit, AutoCAD, Civil 3D, some general Autodesk videos, some little 3ds Max as well in there. We do have AutoCAD and Revit Essentials courses monthly, and you can contact us for more info on those. We do have a Revit 2024 webinar, I believe on the 27th. I was going to write that in, and you can see I didn't finish that slide, but I believe that's on the 27th. You can find the registration link for that on our website. And you can check out our website for more information on products and services as well. I do see somebody asking for the recording. You will receive an email with the recording, but it will also be on our YouTube and website later on today. Okay, and last thing, for additional questions, concerns, anything like that, give us a call at 305-445-6480 or shoot us an email at info@ddscad.com. All right, thank you all for being here so much. Have a great rest of your day.